Angular reactive forms have a useful set of built-in validators, but it's not so obvious how you would validate something like username uniqueness when those usernames are saved in an external database such as Firebase. For something like that, you're going to need to build your own custom asynchronous validator, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you today. The validator is going to see if we have any users with a specific username in the Firestore database, and if so, it's going to trigger a reactive validation error which we can respond to in the front end. First, make sure to like and subscribe, and grab the source code from angularfirebase.com because you'll be able to use this validator throughout your reactive forms. We'll get started from a brand new Angular 5 app, and I've installed Angular Fire 2, so follow the install instructions on the official repo. I've also created a basic sign-in component, which is in the declarations, and then we're importing the reactive forms module in the import section, in addition to our Angular Fire dependencies. In this demo, I'm making the assumption that you have some custom user data saved in the database, but the validator can work with any type of asynchronous data, whether it's from Firebase or some other source. If you're brand new to Firestore Auth, I recommend starting out with episode 55. The end result of that lesson is a collection of users in the Firestore database. Each user document has some custom user information saved about them. In this case, we have a username, and we want to validate that every new user has a unique username when they sign up. So the first thing we need to do is build out a reactive form to collect the user information. Inside of our component, we import Angular Firestore as well as our reactive form classes. Then we can inject Angular Firestore and Form Builder in the constructor. Then to build out a reactive form, all we have to do is declare it as a property and then call Form Builder group along with our actual form control fields. We'll go ahead and give it a form field for email. The first value here is just an empty string which defines the default value. Then we can pass it some default validators that we get from Angular. So this will say that the email address is required and that it needs to be in a proper email format. Then we'll go ahead and do the same thing for username and validate that it's required. So that just gives us a vanilla reactive form in Angular. But before we get to the HTML, I want to give you a tip that will keep your code concise and readable. I like to set up a getter for each of my form fields because when we get to the HTML, we can just say email rather than having to say this login form get email for each of our validation rules. HTML forms have a lot of boilerplate markup, so this will just make your life a little bit easier. Now let's finish out the basic reactive form in the HTML. First step is to pass our login form to the form group attribute. Then we set up a couple input elements and pass in the form control name for its corresponding name. And that's all it takes to build out a basic reactive form. Now we're ready to get into the fun stuff. We're going to jump back into the TypeScript and build our custom asynchronous validator. To do that, we're going to need map, take, and debounce time from RxJS. When building a custom validator, it's important to look at the underlying validator interface from Angular. A validator is just a function that takes a form control as an argument and then returns either an error object if it's invalid or null if it is valid. The tricky part for us is that we also have a third-party dependency with Angular Firestore. There are a couple different ways you might handle this, but I think the cleanest way is to create your own custom class and then wrap the validator in a method that takes Angular Firestore as an argument. This allows us to pass Angular Firestore as an argument rather than trying to bind it in Angular through some other mechanism. So we have a class called custom validator that has a static method called username that takes Angular Firestore as its argument. Then we'll go ahead and return a function that adheres to that interface that I showed you just a couple seconds ago. It takes a form control as the argument, so we can get the value from the user's form by just calling control value on it. Username should typically be case insensitive, so we'll make the form value 2 lowercase. Then we make our validator asynchronous by returning an observable. We can get our observable from Angular Firestore by calling AFS collection users, where the username property equals the username that the user is typing into this form. That gives us a reference, and then we call value changes to get the observable. But the problem is we need an observable that completes. Angular Firestore will just send a continuous stream of data, which doesn't quite work for this validator. Instead of resolving to either valid or invalid, it just stays in the pending status. To solve this problem, we can just pipe in some RxJS operators. The first one is debounce time, which will delay the query while the user's typing. Instead of making a query for every keystroke, we'll wait for the user to stop typing for 500 milliseconds and then send the query. Then to make sure the observable completes, we just call take1. Angular Firestore is going to give us back an array, and we can see if that array has any objects in it, and if so, we know that that username has already been taken. So we'll map that down to the proper interface by saying if the array has length, then it's going to be an error message. Otherwise, we're going to return null, which means that the form is valid. That takes care of our custom validator. Now we just have to add it to our reactive form. We just go back up to the form group and add it to the validator's array like we would with any other array, except that we pass it Angular Firestore as an argument. Now we just need to set up some HTML to give this user some good feedback with this asynchronous validation. I'm setting up an ngIf statement, and because we have a getter for the username, we can just say username invalid and username dirty. We'll go ahead and show an error message that that username is already taken. If the username is valid, then we can just show a username is valid message. And the other possible state is that the validation is pending. That means the user typed into the form, but we're still waiting on the response from Firestore. When that's showing, we'll just say hold tight, checking availability of that username. As a final touch, we'll want to disable the form submission when the form is invalid. So we just bind the form valid or invalid property to the disabled property on the form submission button. If we start typing into the username field, you can see it brings up that pending message. And then in this case, Jeff D23 is already taken because we have an object in that array. So we get this already taken message. So you could easily reuse the same logic to validate an email address or anything else that needs to be unique across all of your users in Firestore. If we start typing again, it goes back into the pending status. Then a second later, it returns an empty array telling us that that username is available. I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. If this video helped you, please like and subscribe. And if you're serious about building apps with this stack, consider becoming a pro member at angularfirebase.com. You'll get access to a huge ecosystem of resources designed to help you build and ship production-grade apps. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.